Welcome to the history of the Batman with Londyn, brought to you by Meltdown Comics and Collectibles in Hollywood, California. This is where we relive the defining moments of one of the most iconic figures in comic art and literature, the Batman. My name is Adam Silverstein, and I'm joined with her Batness, Londyn. Also from the shadows, you may get to hear from our main man, Shadow Adam. Also like to shout out Mason Booker here, our engineer and producer. Today, we are discussing a very, very interesting topic that is relevant in news, with kids, with adults, with everything. We are talking about the use of guns in comics, in the Batman comics, and essentially his moral compass with regards to killing. So, Londyn, what is this topic where are we going with this?
Well, I feel as I talk to the followers and more people and more Batman fans, they usually have this notion that Batman has always been a no guns and no killing, and that's been a rule that's been set in stone for him. And just the history of him using a gun as a weapon, or him killing anyone or anything, or just even the thought process of whether killing is wrong or right in certain situations has kind of developed over time, and it's due to inner and outer, workings of comic books. And I think even if there's a certain part, or if you like the aspect that Batman doesn't kill people, or that he doesn't use guns, that he uses his own tech, or he uses his own strength, that any part of Batman is an important part of his history. And I think we just need to expand upon it a little bit, see why it was so prominent for him to use this weapon or to have this mentality in the early or the late 1930s and the 40s, and kind of see why that aspect went away in comics and kind of essentially in other media such as film and television.
So right now is the standard no killing?
Pretty much, yes.
And is but it's not always been like that.
But it's not always been like that. And I think just seeing why or how it pretty much got to the point that it is today, that he doesn't kill and he doesn't use guns, I think it's just an interesting progression of just time over Batman stories and comics. So I'm really interested to talk about that.
All right. Well, I think you got some good music to to back you up on that this week.
I think so.
All right. So I guess probably with a topic like this, to kind of trace the evolution, we should probably just start at the beginning. So Batman is first created, and where is he at with regards to the extent of violence he will use to stop the bad guys?
Well, first, Batman was created by Bob Kane, who was inspired by Pulp Fiction stories and comics, and definitely The Mask of Zorro, and all these kind of dark figures. And along with Bill Fingers wanting to make him a kind of scientific detective, you kind of it's created the Batman, which was, he originally debuted in Detective Comics 27 from 1939. And pretty much shortly after his introduction, I mean, for the first year he's in comics, literally his first year, from April of 1939 to April of pretty much 1940, he's by himself. He doesn't have a sidekick. He doesn't have anyone. He's just fighting crime alone, and he is kind of a much darker figure in his mentality and his look and in his kind of manner with going about, different stories. And you first prominently see a gun and him use it in Detective Comics 32, which is October of 1939. So it's really not that far from his debut, and it's in a story that, if you're following, we talked about in the last episode. It was the Batman versus vampire, and he has to defeat the supernatural villain Mad Monk and he's a vampire. So usually in most lore, to kill a vampire, you have to, stake him through the heart. But in this case, he fashioned silver bullets and shot both him and his accomplice and said, "You aren't going to harm any other mortals ever again," and shot them. Now, it's his first time kind of prominently using a gun and killing someone, and people can argue that he's not a person, he's a supernatural creature, and it doesn't count, and I've, heard that before, but the fact that he has a gun just on him is, it doesn't shy away from kind of just the almost pulp Western stories that you kind of read along with in Detective Comics, because, Batman was the first, is the first story you read in this series, in this publication, but the other stories deal with different crime and, like I said, different topics and, guns and that aspect, and him being just this dark figure, which kind of was opposite of the very light figure of Superman that, came out a year prior. It's not really surprising that he would use a gun or be okay with the idea of killing another being or person.
Now, in the last episode, you talked about the Batarang.
Right.
So Batman actually used the Batarang first against the Mad Monk.
Right.
And then that didn't work, so he pulled out his gun.
It worked on everything else from escaping werewolves to fighting a huge ape, but to actually kill or get rid of something that supernatural, he had to resort to, I guess, just he made silver bullets out of like melting a candle, and then he put them in his gun and he shot them both in their coffins, and then him and his fiancée Julie Madison went swinging into the night, and that's how the issue ended.
So when do you know when the next time Batman used a gun to actually kill somebody or to shoot somebody?
Well, you see, even if it's not to kill somebody, you see it right in the next issue, because on the cover, which was a cover by Bob Kane in Detective Comics 33, next month over, you see him wielding a gun on his hip. He's kind of flying into a car with these two crooks, and so he's pretty much the whole cover. So you see that, and then what's interesting is that issue is the first time you read the origin story of Batman, because prior to it, he didn't have an origin story. You didn't know how he came to be, and I think it's called like The Legend and How He Came to Be. And you see that pretty much they're walking home from the theater, and this random mugger wants to take Martha Wayne, his mom's pearl necklace, and then Thomas Wayne puts up a fight, and then the mugger shoots Thomas. And even though in this first origin she kind of dies from shock, Martha Wayne passes away as well. And so Batman just watches his two parents been murdered by a gun. And so a lot of people think that because he was killed, his parents were killed with a gun, that's the main reason why, in comics now, that he wouldn't use a gun in his defense against people like the muggers that killed his family. So, which is a good theory. It's not necessarily solid or isn't, written down like this is why. It's, there's just different reasons why, but I mean, that's what a lot of people go with. And in the ending panel, even though you don't see him shoot anybody, you see him shooting something. He pretty much uses it to shoot a ray machine and to make it explode so he can escape the building. So even in there, when he's pointing at the machine, he's like, I hope I don't die with the explosion. I mean, he's not killing anybody.
We're getting cheered on by the way.
They like this story too. He doesn't necessarily kill somebody, but he does use the gun to escape the situation he's in. So it's not like the Batarang, but I mean, he has it on him when needed, and it's never really been much of a problem in 1939 or 1940.
Bullets sound cheaper than Batarangs.
Yeah.
That's definitely true. But when you see him, I guess, kill someone or threaten to kill someone is probably a few issues before in Detective Comics 29. So that's 2 issues after his debut in 27. And he's dealing with his first big villain, Dr. Death, who is actually kind of was resurrected in the New 52, the Scott Snyder and Capullo stories, which I always found interesting. But he does pull out a gun and threaten his henchmen and say, if you don't tell me where this person is, I'll kill you. So it's kind of, he may not use it to kill people, but he's using it actively enough where he's comfortable with it, or he doesn't have a problem with using it if he has to.
Right.
It's kind of just more prominent. It's part of his, his arsenal. He has a gun, he has a batarang, he has a utility belt, he has a bat plane, all the other stuff. It's kind of just there. But the next time he doesn't kill someone with the gun, he kills them with his foot, which is interesting. It's in the next issue, Detective Comics 30, which continues on with the Dr. Death story. He kills one of his henchmen who is leaning outside of a window, an open window, and Batman grapples down and snaps his neck with his foot. And he pretty much killed someone with his foot, which is as graphic as it can be. I mean, it's pretty full force, and he didn't have any remorse about it. He was just, that's just something I have to do. So you kind of see...
That is actually pretty shocking.
And even looking at it, I mean, the panel itself, when his foot lands on his neck, there's a, the big, onomatopoeia says snap. I mean, it's very graphic. But then he just keeps going. It's not, a moment of, oh no, I killed somebody or I did something. It's like he is a bad guy. He needed to go, and I have to continue on with my mission of stopping Dr. Death. And he doesn't have anyone with him, a Robin character yet. He's on his own, and he's just being, anytime any crook sees him, he's like, oh, it's the Batman. It's this. He's just a very dark figure.
It's almost like a early version of the Punisher.
Right. Even though in every issue, he pretty much knocks them out, makes them unconscious.
Not as extreme as
not
the
as
Punisher,
extreme, but definitely.
But willing to use that type of force.
Exactly. He's not withholding that, because, he thinks it's wrong. He uses it when he needs to. And you still see, like, the imagery of him wielding a gun in Detective Comics 35, which starts in January of 1940. The big splash page is him, having a gun in his hand and is about to shoot it. And I mean, it's just the most...
What issue is that?
35. Detective Comics 35. I think it's January of 1940 is the cover date. And there's a splash page, which, is the one inside, not the cover page. And it's the least subtle image, I think, of him holding a gun in this early of an age as possible. I mean, it's to the side and it's a smoking gun. It's pretty much he just shot it.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's him holding a gun and he shot it to somewhere, either if it was someone or something. But really after that panel, you still continue to kind of see him use a gun in the next issue, in issue 36, and he's kind of using it to actually summon the police. He's trying to get Commissioner Gordon's attention because at this point there's no bat signal. There's no him flicking it off in the sky. I mean, that doesn't come yet. So he uses a gun. We're not really sure where it comes from, but like I said, I mean, it's wielded on his hip in the other issues. It really doesn't have a significant change until Detective Comics 38, which comes out in April of 1940, is when Dick Grayson first debuted as Robin the Boy Wonder, and he gets his own origin story. And of course, Dick Grayson was brought in to lighten Batman up pretty much, and to kind of appeal to a younger audience, because of course with the stories that Batman's been having, from dealing with supernatural vampires to just dealing with evil doctors, and just it's all kind of, very Pulp Fiction, kind of dark, and he needed a balance to pretty much appeal to a wider audience, kind of appealing to the audience that Superman already kind of had, because even though Superman, his mentality has changed, and it's interesting to look at that as well. He obviously, Metropolis is bright and light, whereas Gotham City and Batman is a little bit darker. But once Dick Grayson kind of came in, then that's when you kind of see Batman and Commissioner Gordon and Robin starting to say, you don't really use guns in a fight. Although you see, them using guns kind of in a more World War II propaganda in the, in 42 and 43 and 44. But yeah, once Dick Grayson was introduced, that's kind of when he kind of started leaning back towards using guns. So, carelessly, and just, he doesn't really use it as a weapon at all.
So were there societal pressures that were happening that caused this change, or was it simply the introduction of a young boy, the storyline that required, this change in philosophy?
I think it was more just for DC Comics or National Comics, or, national publications as they were before. I think they just wanted to broaden Batman's horizons and audience, because he was already such a popular character, just being in one story of Detective Comics each month, that in the same year they gave him his own publication, Batman #1.
Oh, you mean that societal pressure making money?
Exactly. I really think that's as simple as introducing Dick Grayson was just really trying to get more people into reading Batman comics. And of course, even the demographic today, it starts with, age 13 and even younger. And it's, they want they wanted more people to read the comics. And so I think that's why Dick Grayson was introduced. And I think, just thinking of it in a logical sense, you really wouldn't want a young boy who's the sidekick, and you shooting your gun every other, time. It's kind of, and when he trains, Grayson into being Robin, he trains him with all the martial arts and the acrobats, and kind of having him use his own, physical talent instead of, just using, a gun. And you kind of start seeing that in following issues. Once Batman #1 came, you even sooner in Batman #7.
What year is this?
That is, I want to say 1942. I want to say, yeah, that makes sense. Commissioner Gordon, in one of the panels, he's in like a in a courtroom. He pretty much says that Batman and Robin, they never use guns or weapons, and that kind of mentality stays within the internal stories of Batman. But what really triggered, them changing it so drastically was actually in the first issue of Batman #1, where Dick Grayson was there, and they have to go up against Hugo Strange, which is one of the first Batman rogues that kind of still remained, before Joker and Catwoman, who were introduced in this issue. Hugo Strange was there in the early Detective Comics stories, and he makes these giant monster men, and they're pretty much like, they have like a zombie type mentality, and they're just these huge guys that, it's like kind of like a Hulk smash type of thing. And Batman has to go up against one of them, and in the end, he ends up, while he's flying his bat plane and he snatches him with a rope, he pretty much hangs him from the bat plane. And you see his body just there, and then he says he was better off this way. So even that panel, and Robin was involved in the story and everything, but once that happened, I think just editorial-wise, they wanted to kind of get away from such, violence.
Yeah, I wonder though what that conversation was like. Because I guess that it sounds like that was maybe the last point, the last straw, or
exactly
the tipping point that ultimately.
I mean, even if in Batman's logic, he wasn't really a person. He was kind of, manipulated and, transformed into this giant kind of just being that, doesn't really have, who's not like human. He may think like, oh, okay, well, it's fine to kill him, because he's not, it's better for him this way. Having that mentality that pretty much stopped after that incident, and moving forward, in the 40s, the most you would see Batman, with a gun is pretty much on World War II propaganda, which was trying to get people to buy war bonds to support the troops. There were issues like there's Batman number 15, which is a little bit after. It's kind of like mid 42, 43, like early 43, and Batman is holding a rifle and is shooting it, but it says keep the bullets flying, go with, keep and buy war bonds. I mean, it was stuff like that. And same thing with World's Finest with Superman, Batman, and Robin, and same thing with Detective Comics. At that point, after, when it was after World War II, you didn't really see Batman using a gun or really, using it in that way. And it really shifted once the 50s started.
Real quick, did Batman fight in World War II? I know Captain America did.
Right, Captain America did, but Batman, no. He wasn't necessarily drafted, I don't think, in any of that.
I don't think he was drafted, but maybe he went over to, bust some Nazi heads or something. But
no. The only time he would really deal with Nazis is if they were secret spies coming into Gotham.
Yeah, okay.
That's the only time he really had interaction, which happened a lot in those stories.
So he was fighting the war.
He was fighting the war, but just on his home turf. But then telling everyone to go out and still support the troops that are overseas.
Right.
So he was...
Did he kill any of the Nazis?
And that's what's interesting is that, when Batman fights, and especially in the 40s stories, you kind of, there's a very thin line between knowing whether he killed them or if they're kind of unconscious, because you kind of just don't see them anymore. So it is a total possibility that the random crooks that he fights, or if he's fighting them and then he pushes them off, a building, he technically killed them, or, he pushes them in front of like a moving train, or he falls into the ocean. I mean, you would think, okay, those were fatal, fights. So, and that necessarily didn't really bother anybody, or Dick, wasn't like, oh, gee golly, you just killed somebody. That never really came up, but more of him not using a gun was really implemented into a lot of different comics at the end of the 40s and kind of the early 50s. Yet you still kind of saw him use them in kind of random situations. He would have a gun in kind of the later, like in Detective Comics 121, he shoots at Commissioner Gordon, but it's part of a whole scheme, and he has a bulletproof, vest on, and, he uses a gun then. He uses a gun, in different, but then he'll use a gun in different scenarios and then say, I've never used a gun before. It's kind of like a continuity plot hole, like in the issue Detective Comics 260, which was in 1958.
Real quick before you go there.
Definitely.
So there's a golden age of comics, right? And that's up to the early 50s?
Right. That's pretty much I would say 54.
Okay, so the 30s to 54.
Right.
And now you're talking about stuff in the Silver Age?
Right. Silver Age pretty much starts the late 50s, which is after 54. And that pretty much goes to actually technically the mid 80s, even though you see the genre Batman stories transition into a darker theme, it's still considered, the modern age doesn't really come until the mid 80s, when stories like Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns and Batman Year One and things like that kind of come into play.
Okay.
And that's considered modern, I suppose.
Okay, so now you're back. I'm sorry, you were at issue 100 you were talking about?
Yeah, I was at Detective Comics, I think 260, and it's like the late 50s. No, it's fine. And it's like in 58. And I mean, he pretty much uses a rifle to shoot at a target, but in the panel it just is like, it's like, but he says he's a crack shot, but he doesn't remember ever using a gun. There are certain instances in the 50s that kind of wash out that the 40s and his first year ever happened. It's kind of like they're trying to ignore the fact that he ever even used a gun. And then there's this one issue, Batman number 65, where he's talking to a governor and he's giving him a license to carry a pistol, and he's as Bruce Wayne, he's not Batman. And then in his mind, he kind of has a thought bubble. He's like, Bruce Wayne, not even Batman, would ever carry a pistol. I mean, it's kind of interesting how they, especially Silver Age is defined as, especially with the Comics Code Authority, cracking hard on, the comics being much lighter, not much violence, not much, sexuality or sexual innuendo, and kind of making them much more kid friendly. Him, kind of forgetting that he ever used the gun would make sense in the writer's perspective, kind of washing out that time where he was a little bit more violent, a little bit more dark. But I think once you kind of get past the 50s and 60s, it's much, much rarer to see Batman use a rifle or a weapon. And I think when you look at it in the later years, like in the 80s and the 90s, that's those times where he uses a weapon such as a gun is interesting, because it's kind of, they kind of have 3 decades of kind of just implementing, you don't use guns. And I'm pretty sure in one of the issues in Batman 129, there, they used to get, the editor, questions, and people would write in and they can answer them. And one of them was, why doesn't Batman carry a gun? Just very straight and simple. And the response was pretty much, they said, we rely on our resourcefulness and our wit and our intelligence to beat, the bad guy, and not on weapons, that are violent.
Did Batman ever say this? In the comics?
I mean, in the comics, he would. There were instances where they would come, Batman and Robin were fighting against a group of thugs, and he would want Robin to take him out using just his fists and his acrobatic, ability and all of that. And he would almost do like an aside saying, only, cowards and yellow people would, use a gun and not use, their fists and them. It's like pretty much like almost a after school special saying, don't use weapons, don't use guns. Those are too violent, if you have to fight with what you have and not, that. So
not only would he not do it, but he would affirmatively state that that would be a problem if you were to use it.
Right. It was almost, overly used, because just if he never used a gun again, that would be enough. But there are just instances where he kind of tells you again, hey, don't use a gun. And
that kind of sticks with me, actually, as a, growing up and following Batman.
Right.
That particular don't use guns, and I in my mind, I imagine I'm actually telling that to Robin. So
right.
It seemed to stick.
Right. And and that approach would, of course, appeal to a younger audience, just as they wanted Dick Grayson to appeal to, because they're not trying to tell kids to go out and get guns and shoot the bad guys. They would rather, have them, learn how to fight, or even, but
Or outsmart the
or
guy.
outsmart them, use their wit, you
Well,
know.
yeah, it sounds like Batman took kind of a role model stance around that period.
Exactly. He kind of became this kind of modeled citizen, you know, was aligned with the GCPD and Gordon, and, you know, kind of became a stand right citizen of Gotham and tried to like show what was right and what was wrong. And each story kind of brought almost, you know, kind of moral lessons that you could learn from, especially if you're younger. And, you know, it's almost like, you know, be nice to people, share, and don't do this and don't do that. And those kind of definitely were underlined in stories, especially in the 50s and 60s during the Silver Age.
Right. And then it seemed that mentality or that characterization of Batman seemed to enter into the Adam West series.
Definitely. I think that's a big reason why. I mean, people call it campy today, but it was just pretty much taking what the comics had at that time and putting it into live action. I mean, you know, when he has to go in the first episode and they have to go in the Batmobile, you know, he reminds Robin to put on his seatbelt, and, you know, or he says, oh, you can't go into this party because you're too young and there's drinking. And it's just, each episode was, even though it's like it's overly saying, you know,
do the right
thing, that's how the comics were. And it had those underlying tones anyway. So definitely, you know, you wouldn't see Adam West carrying a gun. He would just use that really huge batarang that would come out of that small utility belt somehow and use it to hit an enemy, and even then, he would use his own. I mean, that's how you would get the pows and the kapows. He would use his fists and he would kick and he would fight, you know, like hand-to-hand combat. He wouldn't really even use a batarang. So definitely that was seen in the live action at the end of the 1960s. And even in the following animated small series that came in the 1970s. I mean, it was the same kind of mentality. You know, it was the same kind of teaching a lesson to the younger audience and really staying light.
Is that the Batman that would guest appear on Scooby-Doo?
Yes. So if you see Scooby-Doo and Batman, those are the episodes, definitely like mid-70s. Those are the ones.
And that's also the Justice League, the early.
Right. Super Friends and, you know, and all those incarnations that came out for the next 2 decades of that. But yes, definitely same thing. I mean, it was, I mean, it's a cartoon. So
he was the street version of Superman, you know,
right.
of do everything right.
Exactly. And I guess that's why it's interesting to look at him when he first started. Before, he had a young sidekick that he had to kind of be almost role model, father to, you know, teach him what's good and what's bad, what's right and what's wrong, and kind of develop a different moral compass than he did when he was in the late 30s, early 1940s.
Well, it's interesting because maybe early on it was pretty extreme,
right?
And then it evolved into something extreme, but at the other end of the spectrum, and then it starts to change again.
Right. I mean, it was pretty extreme from the 60s and even the 70s, just kind of, you know, jamming in, you know, don't use guns, and we don't use guns, and we use our wit and our you know, physical, you know, martial arts and all of that. And then it kind of died down, and when it got into modern comics, and he still had, for, you know, most of the continuity, that same mindset that, you know, you don't kill and you don't use guns and you're not violent in that way. You know, fight the opponent and outsmart them and use, you know, your knowledge to pretty much win the fight instead of just going to straight, you know, lethal ways. And then you see in the mid 80s when Frank Miller comes with The Dark Knight Returns in 86 that he just, to protect, you know, these group of children, he just shoots off rounds of bullets, at the opponent. And even though it's argued, oh, well, they're rubber bullets, so he wasn't killing them or anything, just the visual fact.
It hadn't been around
It
for
hadn't
years.
been around for years. And so that was something that was really extreme at the time. And it kind of played into how Frank Miller, how much The Dark Knight Returns, whether you're a fan of it or not, was groundbreaking in the sense that it introduced a lot of different factors that Batman had kind of been wrestling with, such as using a gun, and...
Are there people who aren't fans of that?
Oh, yeah.
Really?
And there are people who are just fans of that arc and nothing else of Miller's. They may not like Sin City or any of the other things that he's done, or Daredevil or any of that. They may not, they might just like that. But there are people, I've come across people I've talked to who just don't, they're like, I don't know why there's so much, pretty much hype about The Dark Knight Returns. I don't know why it's so important. And, and that's almost something that could be another episode in the future. Definitely just focusing on that. But the visual fact of him using pretty much a rifle gun and just going off rounds and rounds and rounds, that visually was a real big, that just kind of concerned people a little bit. They were wondering, are we going back to him, shooting people and using guns? But really, it's, even though it wasn't, such, every issue telling people you don't use guns, it was kind of more subtle. The 80s kind of went on, and the thing that kind of came up was the year later when Batman Year 2, which was in 1987.
Who wrote that?
I know Alan Davis did the art for it, and it was in Batman 575 through 578, and the covers themselves, visually, it was daunting because the 2 out of the 4 covers had Batman holding a gun, and in 575, he's just holding, he has a gun and he's just holding it and he's just standing there. So it's kind of, you don't know what's going to happen in the comic, you don't know what the story is, but all you see on the cover is Batman holding a gun. And
it was written by Mike W. Barr.
There you go. That's right. And pretty much in the story, Batman struggles with using a gun and killing because he comes across Joe Chill, who is introduced as the person who murdered his parents, Thomas and Martha Wayne. And he still has Joe Chill's gun pretty much in his house, and he's never used it or anything, but he just goes back and forth pretty much between these issues, contemplating whether or not to use it because he's just struggling so much. And in the end, he doesn't use it. He doesn't use it against Joe Chill, but just the fact that it was something so bothersome to him, or kind of him, going against, should I get vengeance by killing the man who killed my family? Or, should I stand by what I represent, which is, I don't kill, I don't use guns, which was kind of both, combined. So back-to-back stories with after Miller and then Barr and Davis' story, it kind of introduced the whole gun aspect, which people were kind of already comfortable with, that he doesn't use guns. It's like, 30 years of almost like brainwashing, like, you don't use guns, you don't use guns, you don't use guns. And then kind of when it comes to the modern era, it's not, like I said, it's really rare to see him use a gun at all. He uses all of his other gadgets. He uses the Batarang. He uses all of the different things that, and he uses just his fighting technique. And
you said rare to use guns. What about rare to kill?
Rare to kill is kind of in the same category. In a particular issue, it's all kind of in the late 80s when all of these dark stories kind of come, which that period of time is always fascinating to me. When he has to fight the KG Beast in Batman 420 from 1988, they end up in this underground chamber and they fight, they duke it out. And then the Russian assassin is really injured. And Batman pretty much just locks him down there and leaves him there, pretty much for dead. And when the police come, he's like, don't worry, it's being taken care of. Now, probably about 15 years later, this was retconned, and they mention it that the police go and actually save him, the Russian assassin that he locked away. So it kind of takes away he didn't kill him. But the fact that it was originally written that he was leaving him for dead, that he thought that it was fine for him to pretty much be out of existence because of all of the damage and all of the killing he was doing. So that's why it's interesting when with certain characters, which is, like I said, it's very rare. Like, this is one of the rare instances that Batman would even do that. With a character like that, he was okay with just leaving him for dead, whereas he has been fighting characters like the Joker for, decades, and he's done horrible things just as horrible, and yet he won't, take the initiative to kill him, whether it's with a gun or with his hands. And so it kind of calls back to, he has this no-kill rule, yet for one of the most dangerous men that he's ever come across, he can't break it. And so it kind of makes you look at Batman and kind of what his, psychosis is and what he thinks about and what he deems right and wrong. And so even though he doesn't kill, and, everyone likes that, they're like, oh, he doesn't kill anybody or he doesn't use guns, he comes across many different opponents that should probably not exist and he could easily take out, but he decides not to. And you really don't see Batman use a gun. There's an instance in Detective Comics 710, it's from 97, where he uses a gun to take out a sniper that's about to take him out. So that's another thing of, if I don't do this right now, I might not make it. He might be thinking of his own self-preservation, but, and I think probably in the more modern age, the most memorable time Batman has used a gun and has even said, I am going against me using a firearm, is during Final Crisis, which was written by Grant Morrison, main art by J.G. Jones, and that was in 2009. Batman has to go up against Darkseid. And, that's a Superman villain, which is fitting for Superman. But, going up against Batman, it's kind of like, who pretty much would.
He's got to use whatever he can.
Right. And so he uses a gun, and the bullet has enough power to actually kill Darkseid. It had the power to kill Orion and just that whole story. And he shoots it, and it pretty much misses, and Darkseid uses his fire beams and it ricochets and gets Batman. And in that story, that's where Batman apparently dies. And that leads to pretty much a year-long story of Batman not being in comics. And that's how, Battle for the Cow happened. That's pretty much how Dick Grayson soon became Batman and all that. But that's probably, and that was early 2009, late 2008, the publication. That's probably the biggest modern time where Batman has used a gun. That's straight to, I'm going to shoot you to kill you. And pretty much forward, even into the New 52, it's real. It's, he doesn't kill, he doesn't use guns. That idea is still there. And I always found it interesting that in Final Crisis, they did a gun to kind of try to have him against Darkseid, because right before then, the Christopher Nolan films were out. And I know for a lot of comics, Batman Begins and The Dark Knight essentially kind of influenced a lot of comics. And that's where it kind of originally started. He doesn't, once he was trained, by Ra's al Ghul and the League of Shadows and all of that, and pretty much was making himself his own, what he wanted to be, Batman, and training in the Batcave and making Batarangs and making his own tech and, in combination with Lucius Fox and, Wayne Enterprises and all of that, it was implied, throughout the series that he doesn't need a gun. He doesn't kill. And since the Nolanverse is pretty much a lot of people's introduction to Batman, since it went on from 2005, 2012, I mean, that's a really long period of time, for something to kind of take over that type of media, to take over movies. I think that's where a lot of people who don't read comics, that's where they get, okay, Batman doesn't kill and he doesn't use guns. And so when you tell somebody, well, he did use guns and he did kill at some point, and even in the later years, they're like, no, because he doesn't have to, and, he has this and this and that, and that's against his moral code, and,
So interesting. I mean, when you think about it, or what I've been thinking about, is that if Batman will not kill, then Bruce Wayne would never vote for the death penalty.
That's true.
I mean, because isn't that what, when you think about the death penalty and what that is, we have enough evidence to determine that you've done something that requires you to die.
Right.
That's what the death penalty is. And Batman is a detective, so he gets all the evidence, and he gets the evidence that you can't use in court. He gets real evidence.
Right.
He knows what the Joker's done, for example. He knows what these people have done, and yet he still won't kill them.
Right.
And so he could never vote for the death penalty.
No, he can't. And then at the end of the day, when he lets these criminals go back to Arkham, or they escape, or however they're apprehended, he has to come back to the fact that he could stop it all. I mean, they can all end these people, because he can take out, I know everyone's like, oh, he can't take out certain people, but the rogues gallery that he has, the main villains that he deals with, Penguin and, Two-Face and Riddler and Joker, and those people who are pretty much just regular people that just have, certain issues, and they have their own way of crime. At the end of the day, he has to kind of almost think about, my whole, philosophy of no killing and not using this lethal type of way to fight. I mean, who in the end is it really helping or hindering?
Right. Well, I think the other thing is it makes the reader or the viewer or anyone who's a fan of Batman really kind of reflect on that question themselves.
Exactly.
I mean, what do you believe in? If you have the evidence and you know this and you don't do it, what is that?
Right. What is it? What kind of reflection is it on you and what you believe in or what you think is right? And if whatever you think is right, is it really,
Right. Well, I mean, you even in the news and, every president's going to say, we're going to hunt down the terrorists and we're going to kill them.
Right.
They've done something that warrants a reaction of society to kill.
To kill, right.
And
it's not just to imprison and you just
it's to kill.
There. It's to kill.
Straight up, right? We're going in there and we are dropping bombs and we're killing. Batman knows what the Joker's done, and it's nothing short of a terrorist.
Right, exactly.
And yet he still won't kill. So you really have to kind of ask yourself, where do you fall?
Right, and that kind of plays into just thinking about Batman's sanity and just his whole, crusade of dressing up as a shadowy figure and going out into the night and doing more work, than maybe the police are supposed to do. And just that whole idea of him doing that, it's kind of just as crazy as Joker, except he's trying to do it for good. But then at the end of the day, when he lets homicidal maniacs go, is he really doing the good that he can do?
Mm.
But would you say Batman's never been voiced against, for example, Commissioner Gordon using a gun, and for example, within the Batman family, he even allows Alfred to use the gun.
Right. It's something more personal. It's not necessarily just a society just shouldn't use it, but as, comics have kind of evolved and become more modern, he'll let, like, the only person pretty much in the Batman family he allows is Alfred to use a gun, just in case someone invades the Batcave. And, even though Alfred is tactical himself and can fight, he's still like, if you need to, you can use it. And of course, he is fine with the police force and Gordon using a gun, but it's more, I think, on a personal level, which is why I think people use the theory that his parents, were killed with a gun, and he would not do that to someone else, and he would find a better way to bring them to justice than using that weapon that pretty much transformed him into the hero he is now.
Right. And it's helped him expand his technology and his ingenuity. I mean, he just doesn't have to whip out the gun and kill someone. He has to develop all kinds of tech and whatever necessary to solve the problem.
Right, and that's what makes his stories more interesting, not just the same old hat. It's not just pulling out a gun. It's not just punching somebody. He uses all of his knowledge and technical things he has to be able to solve different problems and, go against different opponents. And I think that's why his stories are still so interesting even today.
So where do you think that Batman's moral compass will be in the Batman-Superman movie?
It's interesting because if you look in one of the scenes, we were able to see it in IMAX on that Monday that they were showing it all over the U.S., and you can see all of the little details that you can't see on your phone or your computer really clearly. And when Batman is standing atop of the building, it's not an antenna that he's holding on. He's holding a sniper rifle. So it's kind of interesting to see kind of where, and just from what you see in the 2 minutes, it's very little, but you see that he has rage, that he feels powerless, that he has a vendetta against Superman or whoever else, and maybe he's using all of the resources he has to maybe take him out, and that could be using a gun.
So stay tuned for that, right?
Definitely.
So again, I am not a DC guy. I just don't read them as much. So tell me in just a quick minute, Convergence. What is that about, real quick? Is that just a whole new revamping of Batman?
It's pretty much a whole new revamp of the DC universe. It's kind of like they had this era of New 52, which was soft reboot, started September 2011. And they pretty much are just...
Wasn't that supposed to be a hard reboot?
Yeah, but the editors called it a soft reboot so they can keep the stories such as the Killing Joke and kind of things that happened before the reboot, and they want to keep those storylines within the continuity. Okay. So that's why it's not a hard reboot. So they kept the stuff they really liked and put it in the stories, and yet they changed certain backgrounds and introduced new characters, and pretty much those universes are kind of almost compiled, and I think this is all due to Brainiac, into new and older universes, which is why you'll see a Batman from today with a Batman that was from the late 80s, or you'll see a Catwoman from, today, and you see her in her Silver Age, and they're pretty much trying to see how these different universes coexist with each other. And it's kind of interesting to see the dynamic, because you get to kind of relive the different heroes in their, older universes or continuities, I suppose. And
so when Convergence is done, will there be one single Batman?
I believe so.
Okay, and
that is what everyone thinks.
So that Batman.
And even Batman right now is a different Batman than it was before, because as of right now, Bruce Wayne Batman is considered dead from the last issue of Batman number 40. And so going into the recent comics, it's someone else that's being Batman. So
how's his moral compass?
It's not necessarily lethal. I mean, he's pretty hardcore, but it's not, I don't know if he'd be wielding a gun, but the type of Batman that's here right now, he's kind of using more tech, like he's kind of almost using like a suit, kind of like it's kind of robotic a little bit.
A little Tony Starkish.
Exactly. I didn't want to go there, but you did it. So, but yes, it is very kind of Iron Man-like. So he might have some, little things on there that might be considered lethal. He might have little things, and I mean that you kind of even see that in the Nolanverse. Even though he's no guns, no killing, the Bat Pod and the Tumbler and all those have little missiles on them, have things that make buildings explode, which could possibly have people in them. I mean, there's still lethal stuff that's within the Nolanverse, but it's very central to Batman himself. It's very central to, no, I'm not going to use a gun, and I'm not going to kill purposely.
Without giving away any spoilers, this new Batman usually carries a gun on the regular.
Right. So it would not be shocking to see that in the comics, but it's a completely different Batman. It's not necessarily the Batman that's, the one that we all know. So
the Bruce Wayne Batman that eventually comes back?
Right. I think he'll still be, I'm not going to kill, no guns. I think he'll still be there.
What is your Batman preference? If you could have a Batman preference, where would he be, either with guns or moral compass or?
I mean, I am a fan of the Golden Age, the first year Batman. Him from 1939 to 1940. I really like that because that's the root of what Bob Kane and Bill Finger wanted. That was the original, type of hero, type of vigilante, type of dark figure, type of pulp fiction type character that they wanted to, be in comics. And I personally don't have a problem with him using guns. However, I do like the fact that he expands on his tech and that, he uses all of these different types of ways to, beat the bad guy. And it's not just, and none of it is superpowers, which has always been a thing with me. And yet he still has to deal with his emotions and, his mental state of knowing whether or not I should kill this person or not. That's why I always really like the Batman and Joker dynamic, because one pretty much cannot coexist without the other, and one refuses to kill the other. So I wouldn't mind if he used guns. I wouldn't be mad, and I wouldn't mind if even he killed someone. That's not really a thing with me. I just like to keep it where he's aware that he's not killing and what that kind of does to him and how he proceeds with fighting crime in Gotham. I think that's always an interesting dynamic to look at when reading the comics.
All right. Fascinating stuff. Wow. I mean, that's a lot. I think we talked about it, some really good stuff, especially with this whole thing where I think the reader, the viewer, or the person consuming the Batman can kind of ask themselves questions about what they think.
Right.
It's really, it really is a deeper conversation to find out where you fall in terms of taking someone's life. I mean, it's not as easy as right or wrong. There are questions.
Right. And I mean, that makes the comic way more interesting. It's not just reading a story. You can kind of be more involved in it yourself. And I think that's how people get, that's why certain heroes are their favorites, because they can relate to it themselves.
Right. So now we've hit some major topics about Batman these first 4 episodes. You have been generous enough to actually allow listeners, if they want, to make suggestions on certain topics that you can research and then talk about, or if they have questions, you'd open the show up to that. So where can you be reached?
Definitely the easiest way to reach me is at my email at historyofthebatman@gmail.com. Or if you are a follower on Instagram, instagram.com/historyofthebatman, you can send me a direct message and I will definitely respond. I am open to all suggestions and any topics or any questions you guys have. Definitely hit me up at my email, historyofthebatman@gmail.com.
Awesome. Thank you, Londyn. And anything else that you want to let the listeners know about?
I've been thinking about the next episode, and it's something that has actually been one of my favorites to talk about on the Instagram account, and I think I'm going to bring it to an episode, and it's called The Myth of the Batman God Complex, and we're pretty much going to go over 10 times that Batman has been defeated and go over why, because I think a lot of people think that Batman, he's so resourceful and he's so brilliant that he cannot be beaten by anybody, and we're going to debunk that theory in the next episode. So that's what you have to look forward to.
That is awesome. So thank you for sharing. As always, it's been a pleasure, and I know that the listeners are excited for the next episode, so please stay tuned. We'll come back to you next week with the history of the Batman with Londyn, brought to you by Meltdown Comics and Collectibles. This show has been produced and engineered by Mason Booker. I'm Adam Silverstein from Meltdown Comics. We have Londyn and our favorite guy lurking in the shadows, Shadow Adam. Thanks again for coming, and we'll see you next week.
Hey, thanks, guys.